Montreal has always been a unique city in North America, but lately they've been taking that one step further by building good transit. They're working on the REM, a massive, fully automated light metro that'll fundamentally reshape the city. Not only will this project double the amount of rapid transit in Montreal, but it's being done at 1/10 the cost of other projects in LA, San Francisco, and even Montreal itself.
Like, this is transformational stuff.
The fact that this project exists is pretty much a miracle.
The wizardry here is the deep involvement of Canada's second largest pension fund, employing a radical new model that's equally effective at building trains and making people angry. The REM is trying to pull off something that nobody has done before. And in this video, we'll see how it could change everything about how we build transit. To understand the REM, we need to know why it even exists. So let's go back around 15 years, when Montreal and its transit were really struggling.
The early 2010s were not a good time for the province of Quebec. Their debt to GDP ratio was over 50%, the highest amongst Canadian provinces, and there was risk that their credit rating could be downgraded, which would have sent that debt even higher. So the province embarked on a tough austerity program, pushing for controversial cuts on everything from daycare to education. This put public transit in an extra tough spot. Montreal was firmly in the top 20 worst cities for traffic across Europe and North America, and its once vaunted metro hadn't been meaningfully expanded since Randy Johnson played for the Expos. But government austerity only meant that it was hard to pay for improvements. It doesn't explain how Montreal got into this situation in the first place.
Put simply, the crew in charge of the city's transportation weren't exactly doing a banger job.
Montreal's transit had long been governed by a slew of separate public agencies, each looking after their own fiefdom and responsible for anything transit-related within it, from strategic planning to day-to-day operations. It was therefore difficult to even form a vision of a coherent regional transportation system, let alone implement one. So in 2015, the Quebec government began reorganizing the whole thing. In a nutshell, an organization called the ARTM would be created out of the ashes of another organization to handle regional-level transportation matters, like planning, financing, and fare integration.
In theory, they would be the ones collecting all the fares and subsidies from cities, from provincial government, and so on, and then redistribute to operators.
Existing transit agencies, like the STM, would then increasingly become pure operators, focused on implementing the ARTM's plans and running the actual train or bus services.
The agency is not the one that has to, balance the book. The ARTM is the one who needs to balance the book.
We'll hear a lot more from Marco in this video, and introduce his work properly in just a bit. Anyway, there are three agencies that are central to the REM story. First is the STM, in charge of the metro and buses on the island of Montreal. Then the RTL, who operate buses mainly within the suburb of Longueuil on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. And finally, EXO, who operate commuter rail and buses across the greater Montreal area. They were also birthed from the same ashes that gave us the ARTM. Since its inception, this ARTM-led setup has pulled off some truly impressive fare integration across greater Montreal, turning over 700 fare products across 17 operators into 4 universal zones, arguably a more harmonized system than any other city in North America. They've also made major inroads on bus lanes and electrification, with the Stinson bus garage in particular drawing praise for leading upgrades to handle electric fleet charging. There unfortunately hasn't been much else to celebrate. High-profile metro expansions have either exploded in cost to over $1 billion per kilometer or stalled out completely at the planning phase after a decade of discussion. And for EXO, the commuter service, 3 of their 5 rail lines don't even run on weekends, part of a distinctly rush hour and downtown-focused service pattern that isn't very useful otherwise. The one thing that EXO did have going for them was the electrified de Montagne line, which they also had full track ownership over. This allowed them to actually run trains at respectable frequencies for most of the day, even as often as every 10 minutes on very limited stretches during rush hour. So of course this line doesn't exist anymore. We'll see why that is later on.
This situation created some key gaps in the city's transportation network.
One of these gaps was the South Shore suburbs. A lack of metro service here meant huge bottlenecks during rush hour to cross the St. Lawrence River into downtown. The most popular crossing, the Champlain Bridge, even carried 48 different bus routes, many of them operated by the RTL. The bridge was also falling apart. Then there was the difficulty in getting from downtown to the West Island, an area encompassing primarily residential communities on the western side of the island of Montreal. The area is very car dependent, with less than a quarter of residents commuting via public transit, contributing to nightmare traffic jams often centered around the A20 and A40. The transit that does exist is largely offered by buses and EXO, including the half-decent De Montagne line before it disappeared. But even that line only peaked at 3 trains per hour running from end to end, while buses were often unreliable or required passengers to switch to an overcrowded orange line to complete trips downtown. And finally, Montreal Trudeau Airport had no rail link. The only transit connection is the 747 airport bus, which does get bonus points for running 24/7 and having a very clever route number, but it's still a bus, which means travel times vary depending on traffic, and that's the last thing you want when trying to catch a flight. And in my biased opinion, rail to the airport is mandatory for any city that wants to be taken seriously. Also, both Toronto and Vancouver have that. So maybe that means something. At this point, let's bring austerity back into the picture. Fixing these gaps would require significant investment in new transit infrastructure, but the government simply didn't have the billions of dollars that are typically required under traditional procurement methods. Some also doubted that even if they had funding, existing public agencies wouldn't actually be able to come together to deliver these projects, and that someone completely new needed to come in with a fundamentally different approach.
And Montreal didn't have to go very far to find that someone, because Quebec is home to the CDPQ.
And his name is John C.
The CDPQ manages a host of public sector pensions, but operates more like a private investment firm, which has helped grow their assets under management to over 470 billion Canadian dollars. Funds like the CDPQ are always hunting for investment opportunities, and in the early 2010s, they turned their attention towards infrastructure.
Markets were fresh off the 2008 financial crisis, and the relative stability of infrastructure as an asset class was very attractive to pension funds, because they mainly provide income to retirees who don't receive regular income from jobs anymore, because that's how retirement works. Pension funds therefore can't be on Wall Street bets. They want investments that provide predictable, long-term cash flows over the span of multiple generations.
Public infrastructure does exactly that. A good bridge, toll road, or transit system can very well be in use for over a century, delivering predictable revenues year in, year out. And pension funds are especially incentivized to maintain these assets properly, so they can keep generating those cash flows well into the future. On top of all of this, the CDPQ specifically had a few extra things working for them.
Their obvious strength was having prior experience investing in infrastructure. They've held an ownership stake in London Heathrow Airport since 2006, giving them development experience with Terminals 2 and 5. Then they also had operational experience from owning 19% of the Eurostar group, but their most relevant position was the role they took as lead investors in developing and operating Vancouver's Canada Line, also a fully automated light metro that's been touted as one of, if not the most, successful public-private partnerships in North America. Going one level deeper, the CDPQ's financial weight gives it incredible social and political influence in Quebec.
The CDPQ is very important in Quebec. The Caisse is a very significant political operator in its own right.
This places them in a unique and well-connected position to deliver major infrastructure projects in the province where other organizations may not be able to. And perhaps most importantly, the returns from CDPQ investments directly flow back to over 2/3 of Quebec's 9 million residents, who pay into 48 pension and insurance funds that are managed by the CDPQ. The gains from their public infrastructure investments therefore aren't being purely siphoned off to the private sector or some random foreign entity.
So the CDPQ had all this experience and the desire to get more involved in infrastructure, and Montreal really needed better transit. What did you think was going to happen? Around 2015, the CDPQ and the Quebec government began floating the idea for a massive project called the REM. It would be a 67-kilometer, fully automated light metro that would double the length of Montreal's rapid transit network.
There are very, very few places that would even dream of building 60-plus kilometers of rapid transit in a single project in the space of barely over a decade.
And I'm so happy to welcome back Jonathan English, who was a huge part of my Toronto video. He's also done quite a bit of research on the REM.
Like, this is transformational stuff.
It would also hit those 3 key gaps we talked about, bringing connectivity to the South Shore, West Island, and airport, and plugging them into a truly regional network that interfaces with the existing metro, XO, and buses. Critically, the REM was also allowed to use an existing tunnel through Montreal and an empty alignment on the new Champlain Bridge that was reserved for a future transit project. These elements combined to save the REM an ungodly amount of money, probably in the billions, and we'll definitely talk about this later.
But what was really radical about the REM was how it would be created.
In a nutshell, the CDPQ is not a passive investor in the REM. They're going far beyond what most pension funds do, carrying out many of the roles typically reserved for government authorities and transit agencies. Let me explain. Even for projects with the highest degree of private sector involvement, the government is often still the long-term owner of whatever's being delivered. Like a new metro line, even if control over the asset is only transferred from the private sector back to the government after 30 or 40 years. So as the owner, the government typically specifies the performance requirements they want, like the line's capacity and frequency. At the very least, they'll outline where they want the line to go, essentially defining a project's scope and purpose. They're also quite involved for the duration of the P3 contract, often carrying out performance monitoring to make sure that the private partner actually does what they say they're going to do. The REM is not this, at least not by my interpretation. For starters, the CDPQ owns the REM for 99 years, with an option to renew ownership for another 99 years after that. That's far longer than the 30 or 40-year contracts we're used to seeing. The CDPQ then played a larger than typical role in defining the scope and purpose of the REM, using their own expertise to adapt and improve upon several proposals that had already been floating around. This certainly required government input and approval, but it wasn't like there was a clear project sitting there just waiting to be built. Instead, the CDPQ came up with a concept that hadn't been seriously considered yet, i.e. an automated light metro spanning the greater Montreal area. They're also responsible for seeking out and managing private partners to deliver and operate the REM, which they did through international tenders that selected the Nouvelle Art and PMM consortia. The government wasn't fully passive. Their previous work helped define many of the project's needs, and they've shepherded in legislation that's been critical to the REM's success. But otherwise, they're taking a step back, simply contributing a fixed amount of equity and paying the CDPQ a set amount per REM passenger to make the system available to the public, depending on how far each passenger travels. The goal is to make the REM a win-win. Montreal gets a 21st century metro without using up scarce government resources, and the CDPQ generates the returns they want, thanks to having the freedom to dictate nearly every aspect of the project and avoid common mistakes, especially regarding cost.
This high level of involvement makes the REM fundamentally different from most other transit projects, and it's central to the highs and lows that we'll cover later on. But first, the CDPQ had to figure out how to essentially build a brand new rapid transit system from scratch, which, even for a well-capitalized firm with extensive infrastructure investment experience, was still a significantly different challenge from anything that they had ever done prior. The CDPQ ended up figuring out a few things, and luckily for us, it came up with a model that we can really learn a lot from.
I think the best way to understand the REM model begins with one single figure: 75 cents. 75 cents is the amount that the CDPQ receives from the Quebec government per passenger kilometer on the REM, indexed against inflation. This is because the ARTM collects all the transit fares in Montreal and redistributes them to operators, so any ridership-based payment mechanism has to involve them. The government is also kicking in $1.28 billion in equity and allowing the CDPQ to collect royalties from new developments along the REM, valued at around $600 million. But other than that, they don't pay for things like rolling stock, maintenance, or staffing. That's all on the CDPQ. And if somehow nobody takes the REM, the government doesn't need to make any minimum payment to the CDPQ based on some guaranteed ridership figure. At least none that we know of.
The financial structure around the payments are, I think, intended to share risk, which I think is realistic because what is going to determine ridership? Partly, it's going to be the service that REM operates. Is it reliable? Is it attractive? Is it fast? But it's also going to be broader policy around the connecting transit network, urban planning, whether we give priority to cars, all kinds of other policy choices that we make are going to determine how many people use REM.
In theory, this arrangement leads to several major win-win situations. Montreal's transit systems currently cost an average of 66 cents per passenger kilometer mostly to operate, and that doesn't include over 75% of their capital costs. So for the government, paying 75 cents for the REM is therefore relatively worthwhile and also predictable to help with future budgeting. Then the metric itself. Payment per passenger kilometer incentivizes the CDPQ to A, get more riders on board, and B, have them ride for longer distances. This should create a high-volume regional system that Montreal needs, and that the government naturally wants to have. By contrast, if the CDPQ were only paid per passenger without a distance component, for example, then they might have just built a tram with a ton of stops. Good for getting more riders on board, but bad for regional connectivity. On top of everything, these payments actually decrease if more people take the REM. If ridership exceeds projections by 15%, the 75-cent payment for additional riders beyond that drops by 20%. And if ridership exceeds projections by 40%, which isn't out of the question, then the government only pays the break-even cost of the ticket. So the ARTM essentially gets to move those passengers for free. This all sweetens the deal to help get government buy-in, which is necessary when handing over a major public asset for a duration of time that exceeds the current age of the country itself. But this is supposed to be a win-win, so the CDPQ also benefits. Making a good deal means that the public sector is fully invested in the long-term success of the REM, which makes it less likely that future politicians would undermine it, for example by rolling back critical supportive legislation. And by positioning themselves as a one-stop shop that'll handle the entire project, the CDPQ justifies, and necessarily requires, a near total degree of control over the REM, which gives them confidence that they can generate the financial returns they want, somewhere in the 8 to 9% range. Of course, part of being a one-stop shop for delivering an entire metro system means doing everything yourself, including financing a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project with minimal government help. Plenty of private players do this, of course, but the CDPQ took this further yet again, putting in $4.5 billion of their own money for a 78% equity stake in the REM as of November 2023. They can do this because they have close to $500 billion in assets and access to plenty more channels of capital as a result. This financial firepower keeps things on track when costs inevitably rise, because the CDPQ doesn't need to make a big fuss about asking the government or other investors for more money. They can just cover cost increases themselves out of their own wallet, which they already have as the REM's budget has risen from $6.3 billion to a bit over $9 billion. And that's what makes this whole thing click. The CDPQ not only has the ability to build this metro the exact way they want to, but they're incredibly motivated to do it well, because their own money is at stake, both now and in terms of future returns. This synergy is explicitly reflected in the REM's price tag, which, even after escalating to $9.4 billion, still represents a below-average rate of budget escalation in North America, believe it or not, and more importantly, the absolute cost of $140 million per kilometer is still incredibly low for the region.
In many ways, it's an entire order of magnitude difference. If New York City could build at that cost, for example, they could build every project on the wish list, from Utica Avenue, extension of the 6 to Co-op City, you name it, for less than the price of what they're projecting to pay for 2nd Avenue alone.
But there's one final ingredient that gets this whole thing going, which I talked about quite a bit in my previous video on the Hong Kong MTR, and that's having supportive policy. The REM's financial viability, and therefore its success, hinges on the CDPQ's ability to work quickly.
Subway or other rapid transit projects are huge. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of people working, and there's really, really, really expensive equipment. You really don't want to have all those people and equipment sitting around.
Which means going up against a way of doing things in North America that tends to slow down the development of transit infrastructure.
This is something that we've seen happen pretty often on other projects, that you have all these people sitting around while they're waiting for a permit to come through from the local municipality, or they're waiting for a gas main to be relocated.
So the Quebec government still had a very important role to play, something that they understood. They first passed a bill literally titled "An Act to Allow the CDPQ to Carry Out Infrastructure Projects."
It had very strong political backing, so everyone knew that you don't want to cause delays unnecessarily for this project. That was something that really helped in getting everybody's minds focused, including people not directly working on the project.
Among other things, the bill included a critical clause making it easier to expropriate land for future projects. This was followed in 2017 by another act that solidified these powers specifically for the REM. For example, making municipalities respond quicker to CDPQ requests in order to speed up permitting processes.
All of these things can add a lot of time, and sometimes this time can compound because if you miss the deadline for one thing because something else is delayed, now you might be waiting another 2 weeks for that thing to be addressed. So really very important if you want to deliver projects cost effectively to have those kinds of outside issues taken care of as much on time as possible.
Agreements were then made with the ARTM to effectively prevent competition with the REM. This brought an end to the many bus routes running along the Champlain Bridge that would otherwise parallel the REM and siphon away ridership. Using the REM as a central trunk with buses feeding it does encourage the creation of a truly comprehensive transit network, but it also led to some of the REM's most vocal opposition, which we'll cover later on. And finally, perhaps the most overt showing of political support was how the government allowed the CDPQ to easily acquire 3 critical pieces of public infrastructure, including the Montreal tunnel. The CDPQ needed the tunnel in order to make the REM work, otherwise it'd be a nightmare to reach the West Island and North Shore directly from the city center. But this desire immediately placed the REM in direct conflict with EXO, because both their Mascouche and De Montagne lines were already using the tunnel. Via Rail also wasn't happy, because they had been eyeing the Montreal tunnel for decades for their own high-frequency or high-speed rail plans along the Quebec City-Windsor corridor. Long story short, the CDPQ were the winners. Going forward, the REM will have exclusive use of the Montreal tunnel. Via will just have to find another way. The Mascouche line will terminate at a REM station north of the tunnel to allow connections towards downtown, and the entire De Montagne line will be shut down to be replaced by the REM. This whole episode definitely made people mad, because it seemed like this massive investment fund was just coming in and steamrolling over every transit agency that Montreal residents were accustomed to dealing with. And that was kinda the whole point. The REM arguably wouldn't have happened at all, or at least be done at this speed and scale, without the political firepower to make these tough decisions. So with all this support, and the legal barriers somewhat cleared, the CDPQ was finally free to let loose their billions. And in April 2018, the REM was officially cleared for liftoff.
Phase 1 opened just 5 years later, a very respectable timeline for North America, especially when considering COVID and the discovery of unexploded dynamite in the Montreal tunnel.
And it's honestly pretty good. My expectations for North America might just be low, but I am genuinely surprised to see things like platform screen doors. It feels like a truly modern metro that you'd find in other countries, and it was built right here in Canada in the 2020s. The system is currently moving around 30,000 riders a day with just the South Shore section open, around 20% of the total network. That's in line with original ridership estimates, with the West Island and North Shore portions aiming to enter service by the end of 2025. There have, unfortunately, also been several high-profile meltdowns, which can't be ignored. But in the meantime, now that we know the history and setup of the REM, I met up with someone who graciously agreed to show me around the system, in exchange for you liking this video, and to help us understand how everything comes together in real life.
Hello, I'm Marco Chitti, and I'm working on transit cost, construction cost.
Cost is a natural place for us to start examining the REM, and we'll first dig into 3 design decisions that, I think, together reveal a hugely overlooked aspect of building cost-effective transit.
The 2 most important dimensions for a station that pretty much determine their cost is how long the platforms are, and 2, it's where is your track positioned.
For track positioning, it's generally true that at grade is the cheapest, elevated costs a bit more, and underground costs more than that, especially the deeper you go. So the REM tries to stay away from underground stations. But going back to that first factor of how long the platforms are, they also kept them short.
The stations themselves are relatively short because the trains are automated, so they can run very frequently. If you have an 8-car train running every 4 minutes and you have a 4-car train run every 2 minutes, it's the same capacity. But the stations cost a lot less to build for a 4-car train.
Building smaller stations might sound like a bit of an obvious way to reduce costs, but I think that this simple idea obscures a far more complex design philosophy.
It's interesting because it's a case where it was designed in the Canadian environment by Canadian firms, which sort of follows some sort of assumption that you see see in terms of what is comfortable, what is like the level of service that we need to require. But the way they interpreted it was really, we need to keep the budget low.
This approach deviates heavily from most Canadian transit projects in recent memory, and it's reflected in other design choices more related to comfort, like the number of escalators within a station.
Do you really need just one that will always be like in the up direction, which is like the most complicated one? Or do you need two? Do you need three? That's a lot of consideration that comes out of the level of service you expect.
Not thinking through these seemingly minor decisions can easily cause costs to snowball, because everything eventually rolls up into budget items that are inherently more expensive, like land acquisition.
You have a row of fixed stairs and escalators, but if I have to double them, we have a highway here, should we like push the highway further out? And then you can't push the highway like forever, and you can, but you have to purchase more land. And that's where a lot of this design guidelines, soft standards, preferences can really change a lot how your station is designed.
How you interpret these guidelines and preferences therefore heavily impacts cost, and the CDPQ undoubtedly made some compromises. It's common to see just one or two escalators leading up to a platform, which means more staircases and lower floor heights. And while lifts are necessary for accessibility, many simpler stations will only have one per platform.
There are a lot of stuff that interplay. If you need to have more space between the landing of these escalators and the next stairs, the stairs move there. And maybe there is something else in between that needs to move further down. Things don't disappear, they just accumulate.
In a similar manner, compromises were also made with where the REM's tracks would run, or its alignment.
One of the other things that saved a lot of money, almost certainly, was that they chose to build a lot of the right-of-way elevated above the ground.
This is generally far cheaper than tunneling, and the CDPQ also got creative about using existing corridors that could be easily acquired and adapted for rail.
They used highway rights-of-way, they used rail rights-of-way, electricity transmission corridors. All of these things meant that they weren't, for the most part, digging out deep underground, which is the most expensive part of most rapid transit projects.
One big downside of doing this, though, is the fact that your transit stations will be sitting in the middle of a highway.
If you're relying mostly on walk-in traffic at a station in the middle of a highway, you're probably not going to be that successful.
So the REM leans on another technique instead.
There are lots of places across North America that have put rapid transit in highway medians. Some have certainly worked a lot better than others. And what is it that makes the ones that are successful? It's that they're embedded in a really good local bus network, so that most of the people coming to the station are coming by bus. But because they did the right things, like get the fares integrated before the project opened, they made sure that the transit service connecting to these stations was at least pretty decent. It meant that you had these really nice big bus terminals at some of the key stations, even along a highway interchange.
And it's not only buses. The REM was also designed with bike connections in mind, with dedicated lanes and infrastructure around each station. The Urbanity has a great video diving into this. We do have to acknowledge that the REM had two extremely fortunate breaks with regards to their alignment. One, being able to use the Montreal tunnel, which we already talked about, and two, the new Champlain Bridge. That bridge was a $4.2 billion mega project that opened in 2019 to replace the older Champlain Bridge along the same corridor. The new 3.4-kilometer bridge was crucially designed with a central deck reserved for light rail, even if it wasn't clear what that system would actually look like. So when the REM started to take shape, it was only natural to have it use the bridge and its surrounding highways, which cost the CDPQ far less than what it would have taken to figure out how to cross the St. Lawrence River themselves. Just for contrast, Seattle's Sound Transit is building an entire bridge themselves as part of the West Seattle Link extension, which also means acquiring significant land to build the guideways that lead up to the bridge. The value for money of that whole project is debatable, but the bridge alone will cost $2 billion. That's the kind of headache that the REM managed to mostly avoid with the Champlain Bridge. Here, I do want to make sure that I'm not equating cost-effective design with luck or a bad passenger experience, because the REM still made the best use of this advantageous position with a few clever choices that I'll just lump into best practices. My favorite example is at Brossard, where the REM station connects to the bus terminal through this covered walkway. It's a small area that wouldn't cost too much money to turn into a fully enclosed space, which would be a much nicer experience in Montreal's winters. But doing so would instantly turn the REM station and bus terminal into one huge combined building. and the whole thing would need to follow strict fire standards regarding fixed guideway transit infrastructure. Instead, leaving this as an open-air covered walkway reduces the complexity of the station, and therefore its cost, all while delivering most of the value of a fully enclosed space.
It's about like code, it's about fire safety, it's about responsibility, because this is probably owned and maintained by the RTM, and this is the property of CDPQ Infra.
Of course, knowing about these opportunities is one thing. Acting on them is another. And why the CDPQ decided to act has a lot to do with the amount of capital and reputation they have at stake.
There was a preoccupation for keeping down costs that I don't see in totally publicly funded projects here. They really tried to stick to this is a transit infrastructure. We want to make things that make it useful. So having this as a climate controlled space is useful, even if it triggers some requirement about ventilation. But at the same time, it's not climatized. So it's one less equipment. That's the kind of compromise that they have done. And you see it in a lot of design choices that they've made. Really this kind of thing that people don't really see.
This underlying attitude is, in my opinion, the true thing to take note of. They critically evaluated the status quo regarding standards and preferences, questioning simple assumptions like the need for more elevators that other projects may have readily included. Specific best practices do matter, but this approach needs to get attention as well, not the idea that escalators are bad.
I left my tripod here, and it's still here. Now we can make the rest of the video. None of this will save you that much money, though, if you don't manage the other side of the cost equation, and that's soft costs, including things like contingencies and escalations. The REM also did pretty well here.
Many projects in North America allocate over 50% of their budget towards soft costs, with contingencies for inflation or scope uncertainty with design changes taking up a large portion of that. These are valuable risks to guard against, but having too much contingency means that projects end up getting loose with their money, because everyone involved knows that the money has already been allocated. We don't have the full breakdown for the REM, but at least their contingencies are in line with international best practice projects. And we also know that they spend less on things like professional services, thanks to a lean organizational structure, and legal processes with things like permitting, thanks to favorable legislation. The REM's ability to set low contingencies can be loosely explained in 2 steps. 1. Having expertise, so you know what you want. And 2. Having political capital, so you can execute on what you want. Starting with expertise. While the CDPQ had up-close experience with projects like the Eurostar and Canada Line, they still didn't have the full range of skills yet needed to pull off the REM.
They're an organization that hadn't previously delivered a transit project, but they put a big priority on hiring people that had successfully delivered projects in the past. By bringing in people that had had success in the past, they were able to hit the ground running and start construction pretty quickly. The quicker they were able to start construction, the lower cost of the preparatory work, etc.
They've stretched this expertise further by concentrating everything into one single division, CDPQ Infra. The result is a small, efficient group that retains people and their knowledge across multiple projects. And without accumulating this expertise, it's really difficult to build transit with any sort of cost efficiency.
We don't build a lot of stuff, so we don't kind of accumulate the knowledge that there will be someone triggering very early in the planning process that's saying, if we do this, it will cost us a lot of money. Please don't. We go down, 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 down. Then after 2 months of work, 3 months of work, when we have a deadline in 1 year, then you say, oh, this is gonna cost a lot of money, but we cannot really backtrack. We promised a lot of stuff to a lot of people, so we will find something that is a compromise that will cost us 10 more, but we save 0.5.
I go way more into this in my previous video about Hong Kong's MTR, so check that out after this video if you haven't already. Anyway, expertise means that the CDPQ can come up with a clear idea of what they want. Then they have the political capital to achieve exactly what they want. Here I'm mainly referencing the legislative assistance we covered earlier for things like expropriations and permitting. This gives the CDPQ reassurance that they won't be blocked by onerous red tape or other disingenuous roadblocks, reducing uncertainty yet again and creating downward pressure on cost. This also creates authority when dealing with the market, with bids for contractors or other third parties. The CDPQ essentially mitigates significant amounts of risk through non-financial means, instead of just budgeting more money to account for those risks. My interpretation is that this stems from a focus on the actual cost of the REM. Instead of trying to prevent cost overruns, that might look worse than they actually are.
One of the problems with the incentive structure around big infrastructure projects is that if a project is late or it goes over budget, that is a front page headline scandal. But if a project costs a lot from the beginning, nobody really knows how much these projects are supposed to cost, so that's generally speaking not a scandal.
And this is the part that most media coverage tends to miss.
We want to create a structure where getting that initial cost down is the top priority, because a project that costs $2 billion and goes over to 2.5 is still a lot cheaper than a project that is projected to be 4 and is delivered at 4. So we want to give a little bit more tolerance to overruns and delays if that means that we can be a little bit more aggressive at the start with trying to find ways to keep costs down.
It's true that the REM has blown through whatever contingencies were initially set, and that the budget has gone from $6 billion to over $9 billion. But would it really have helped to set the original budget at $9 billion and have $3 billion of that reserved for contingency? Or maybe there wouldn't have been as much pressure to innovate in the first place, and maybe the REM would be sitting at $12 billion instead.
Once the higher budget is allocated, it's pretty much guaranteed to get spent.
Phase 1 has been running for 2 years now, and the whole project is approaching a decade old. So we've had quite a bit of time to see where the REM has fallen short, and a lot of it might stem from what's made it so successful in the first place, the strength and independence of the CDPQ.
It's like someone coming, I have a new object, you have to reorganize the entire network around my object, which makes sense from a planning perspective, but also not necessarily transparent at least.
The undeniable benefit is that the CDPQ can move decisively and efficiently, which helps do things like keep costs in check. But critics say that this bold approach is unfair to the public, potentially creating misaligned incentives and locking them in with an agreement lasting close to 200 years.
It's a fair criticism. It creates rigidity, it creates an interest which is not necessarily a public interest, which is built in the contractual structure of the system.
Some will argue that this has already happened. The REM originally did not include the Edouard-Montpetit and McGill stations, which would have prevented the creation of critical connections with the existing metro.
There was pressure from the city of Montreal and from other forces to say, we really need this system to be connected well to the metro. That wasn't necessarily the plan initially, but stations were added at Edouard-Montpetit that connect to the Blue Line. It's a pretty impressive station, really, really deep. And then also McGill station. So the system can function pretty much as an integrated part of the metro network, which would not have been the case if all those stations hadn't been built, and it would have been a much less useful transit project.
We don't know definitively why these stations were omitted originally, but perhaps an extreme focus on cost control led to this shortcoming. Edouard-Montpetit will be the deepest station in Canada after all, and that kind of stuff costs a lot of money. One way of interpreting this is that the CDPQ can be influenced. After sufficient public pressure, they found a way to add these stations with an additional $100 million of their own money, matched by $100 million from the city of Montreal.
Whether or not you agree with these takes, this public criticism manifested itself in a very real way in 2020, when the CDPQ proposed an idea called REM de l'Est.
They tried to plan a second REM project down a major downtown boulevard, elevated, and unsurprisingly that faced a lot of community opposition.
In a nutshell, the CDPQ tried to build REM 2.0, got absolutely skewered by the media and opposition groups, then retreated completely from the idea. I'm honestly not the best person to discuss this, and there are already some great videos about this. But what I will add is that the most harmful aspect of cancelling REM de l'Est might not be that Montreal doesn't get this specific line. It's that Montreal might not get much more after that. Without a pipeline of projects to dig into, all of that hard-earned expertise accumulated through working on the REM can easily begin to erode. This would be true for the CDPQ's own delivery capabilities, but it's also true for any third party that's put significant time and effort into the REM. People like the public sector staff who have spent years learning how to work with the CDPQ and do things like pass cooperative legislation, or the contractors and lawyers who have become really comfortable with building transit projects quickly. These skills can fade in a matter of 5 to 6 years, and if they do, we all pay the price.
And we're also starting to realize that the biggest downside of any antagonism might not be pissing off the public, but disturbing the delicate equilibrium that is Montreal's transit governance.
I think one of the big challenges with the REM project is you are creating a more fragmented regional transit system from an administrative standpoint. And we've seen those problems, for example, when the REM has closed for some teething pains and also testing for the second phase of the network to open. There really haven't been enough shuttle buses to replace the rail service. So that's one of the challenges you have when they're not the bus operator. They're not integrated in a way that would allow them to maybe repurpose or reassign buses very quickly.
But having multiple agencies in a single metropolitan area isn't necessarily a death blow. Nor is it even that unique.
You look in Germany, you have the Verkehrsverbünde in the German-speaking world that bring together all kinds of different operators. You look in Paris, you have SNCF and RATP sharing the RER network. So in Europe, I think there is a little bit more of a culture of multiple agencies within a metropolitan area cooperating together to operate a network that, from the rider standpoint, is pretty much seamless. That's something that Montreal is going to have to get used to. They're going to have to get used to the fact that there are going to be different agencies operating different aspects of the transit system.
And with all these hiccups, it's important to remember how Montreal got into this situation in the first place.
They presented us with this. There would be an automated train with this thing and so on, which is a good thing. Actually, I think they did a good choice in terms of network and stuff, but we didn't really think through all the possibilities. But that should have been done in the 30, 40 years that we spent thinking about projects, but we need to be honest about this.
For what it's worth, the CDPQ have clearly earned themselves more rope. The Quebec government essentially put CDPQ Infra in charge of the Quebec City Tramway in 2023, and they're also part of the Cadence Consortium helping to plan the Alto high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal. The REM might not be perfect for Quebec, but it'll be more than good enough.
The time frame this project went from doesn't exist even in the mind of God to we are actually riding this thing down the bridge. It's absolutely mind-blowing for international standards. Yes, I would have preferred a RER style system that we can expand using existing right-of-ways, but existing right-of-ways are taken by freight in this country. That's the big obstacle. It's not the tunnel everybody talks about. It's everything else. It's fair to make criticism. It's how we improve. But at the same time, it's not like the other option was so easy and it has been taken away by the evil Caisse. We need to be honest about the actual political reality we are doing this thing.
And I also think we can have some faith that it'll turn out okay.
Unlike what people often fear, especially in the US, transit projects have tended to have more riders than we expect. I remember the headlines before Canada Line opened, which were that this line was never going to come close to reaching projections and going to be a white elephant. As soon as it opened, all the headlines were, this line is underbuilt and needs more capacity. I don't know what's going to happen for REM, but my hunch would be that once the full network is open, it's going to be very well used.